My name is Mark Van Moore. I'm in the Advanced Digital Services Visualization Group at NCSA, and I'm going to talk about an ESRT project I did for a couple of closely related projects in the latter half of 2012. PI was Vincent Mute. He was at Michigan, and then he left to take a postdoc at KAUST, so they had to transfer it to Jared Whitehead, who was at Los Alamos at the time, I believe. But really, Benson was who I worked with mostly. Next slide, please. So these are the two projects. There was a research-based project up at the top there having to do with some DiffyQ solvers, and then there was a teaching project for a class that they were putting together for that. Next slide, please. So the research project, this is the particular DiffyQ problem they're going for. It was two-dimensional at the time, though I know that they've expanded into 3D. Pretty decent-sized grid, and that's the research aim there for what they're actually trying to do with the code. Next slide, please. It was really more involved once we got into it. So the actual codes they were doing are very similar between the teaching project and the research project, which is why we decided to do the overlap for them. But when I actually got down to working with it, I worked with the teaching code because they were usually a lot smaller, and so it was easier for me to get a grasp of what was going on and doing that. So these are the goals of the teaching course. So this was aimed at scientists and engineers, grad students that had a little bit of programming background and math through at least calculus, and so it was pretty straightforward introduction class. Definitely had a viz component to it as well, and I have a link there that you can check out later that goes, they put together an entire wiki book for the course that's publicly available. That's a pretty nice resource. Next slide, please. So I met Benson actually at an OpenACC workshop at Pittsburgh, and in between one of the sessions we started talking about what each of us did, and he is very interested in incorporating visualization as a part of his workflow, and partly because of these reasons. He's interested in scaling as large as he can these various differential equation codes, and he's getting to the point where if he scales as much as he wants to, the data is going to be too large to store. They often, as part of their workflow, want to go straight into visualization anyway. They're not are not interested in having to do any intermediate steps. If they can get the pictures straight away, that's fine. And this also gives them, if they do images over the entire domain, it gives them kind of a quick visual way to say, well, where are the regions of interest for this without having to do statistical analysis or whatever. They can kind of look at the output, the visual output, and immediately say, well, here's a region that we can investigate. Let's rerun the simulation over that region. Next slide, please. All right, so actually I hadn't done any of this kind of thing before. Previously, I'd always been given the results of the simulation and work from that. And so this was new for me, so I wanted to look at a couple of different approaches. And the first one we looked at, because Benson was already an avid visit user, was looking at visits in situ support with the LiveSim2 library. So this is a way to instrument your application to hook up to a visit render engine. As I understand it, the original emphasis behind this was on steering simulations. So you'll start a simulation and you'll hook into a live simulation with visit and pause the simulation, do some visualizations there, see how the simulation's going, and then continue the simulation or cancel it if it looks like it's putting out garbage or something like that. Next slide, please. Yes, next slide. Thank you. So we decided against this because at the time, as far as I understood it, and I was basing this off of the info on the Visit Users Wiki, there was no ability to do a batch. You had to do the steering where you hooked into the live simulation. The Blue Waters Viz guy has since told me that I was mistaken in this, but I haven't seen it actually in action yet. So if anybody has actually done that, I'd be curious to know how you went about it. There was also a lot of refactoring that had to be done with the code. And because of the nature of the LiveSim 2, they wanted everything to be in a callback to fit into the LiveSim callback structure. We really had to rearrange a lot of the simulation code, and we didn't like that since it was, we wanted to keep the code as close to the teaching code as possible, as few changes and as few surprises for the students as possible. Next slide, please. All right, so the next thing I tried was pair reviews co-processing. So this worked a little bit differently. This was definitely set up for batch runs, which was more what Benson was interested in. How this works is that the simulation runs, you put some code in it, the code will pause, call a pair review server, the pair review server will load a pipeline that you've already exported from a pair review client and produce images, or you can actually write out VTK data sets as well. Something that's nice with this is that you can go ahead and you can create a simple pipeline using a very low-res version of the data. So I think we were playing around with like a 256 by 256 data set to start, and then that pipeline will work with as you scale up to larger and larger meshes. You can also hand code the pipeline if you're so inclined, but and I tried doing that. It just seemed like they have the export function from the client is really sweet, so we just ended up going with that. Next slide, please. All right, so this, they didn't have anything on the pair review wiki at the time, I don't think, but they did have, with the distribution, of an example of an instrumented simulation called FASTA, which is a Fortran simulation and that had been instrumented into with the co-processing. So we were able to work off of that, and once we kind of cleaned things up and pulled out the coprocessor code into a separate module, in the simulation code itself, we only had to do 4 lines of code, which was really nice. It was the importing the module, initializing the processor, calling the processor itself during the time step, and then finalizing the processor at the end of the simulation. So as far as a student is concerned, looking at the simulation code, so it's very clean. It only it doesn't change the structure at all, and you get all of this functionality with it. You do have to write it, and actually have to do this with the visits to some extent as well. You have to make sure that the data that the simulation is outputting is something that pair review can understand. So that's essentially a VTK data set. So for something that's a regular grid, which we are doing, it's completely trivial. You can just pop in the dimensions of the grid and the spacing, and it'll work pretty easily. I have not ever tried this with an unstructured grid, so I don't know how much more work that would entail. I would be curious to know if anybody has tried that. Let's see. And then you have to write some additional code to activate the coprocessor, which isn't that much. And it worked really smoothly. So the simulation code was in Fortran 90. The kind of extra stuff we pulled out into the module was also in Fortran, but then the actual code for sending the data to the pair review coprocessor was in C++. And we had to hand mangle some names by adding an underscore under some functions, but other than that, it worked very smoothly. Next slide, please. All right, so the first real simulation that we got up going was a CUDA Fortran simulation that he had on NCSA's old Forge. And this was also done with PGI, and probably the most work was actually getting peer review to compile under PGI. And we found a few bugs that the peer review developers were able to get quick fixes for, so that was nice. And we have all the code and all of the associated code from that class up on a GitHub repo, which there's a link there. If anyone's interested later, they can check that out. Next slide, please. So here's just some examples of the output from the 2D Navier-Stokes, the initial conditions, and then later on. And changing the visuals is very easy. You just go into the peer review client and change the color map or the background or whatever and export that, and then you can rerun the simulation and it'll automatically create the new images based on that pipeline. So next slide, please. All right, so then we moved on to the 3D problem. If it's 3D on a single node, its code is essentially the same as the 2D. You don't really have to make any changes. But as soon as you move to multiple nodes, you have to handle the domain decomposition. And this ended up taking most of my development time on the project until I figured out a much easier way to do this. But originally, the code is based on nodes, and you have to send the halo nodes to the coprocessor around the decomposed domains, otherwise you'll get gaps in the images, and then you also have different halos depending on whether you're on the boundary of the problem or the interior of the problem for that. So there was a bunch of additional logic just to make sure that all the right processes were getting the right amounts of data and the halos that they needed. So next slide, please. So then after I went over all of that work, in about 2 hours, I figured out an alternative, which is once these simulations get extremely huge and you're looking at these images, there's more than one cell per pixel. So you can't really tell that it's cell data or node data, depending on how zoomed out you are, of course, for that. So why don't we just pretend that the node data is actually cellular data as far as the coprocessor is concerned, and then we can just send the pencils to the coprocessor for most of the filters. And you may have to, in the filter, in peer review, apply a cell data to point data filter in your pipeline, depending on what you're doing. But it really simplifies things. You don't have to send the halos over. And for most of what we're for most of the visualizations we were doing, everything works smoothly. No gaps or anything like that. So that was a real nice benefit. Next slide, please. So here's an example of the type of 3D problem he was working on. This is the initial condition of some, well, this is abstract mathematical, so they're not really hot and cold regions, but that's how I thought of it as a non-mathematician. And then from this original problem just was a dissipation problem, but I know he's gone on since then and added some turbulence to this. And has an interesting video on his webpage, somewhat similar. Next slide, please. All right, so then once we got that figured out, it was real easy to quick add this to a couple of other codes that he did. We also ported to Nautilus. We had some help from Pragnesh down at Next. And then we started the Kraken port, but then cross-compiling peer review, we ran into a brick wall. And I have some more info about that in a couple slides ahead. So then that was when the scope of the project ended. Next slide, please. So after that, Benson has gone on, and Benson is actually now in Europe at University of Tartu, and has colleagues all over the place that are taking this code or basing some changes in their own code and porting this onto different machines. So it's been on that list that you see there. We were also in progress on those machines at the bottom. And they've been very, I think they've been very happy with it. I think almost everybody here is a pure mathematician, except for myself in that list, and Utkarsh at Kitware. Next slide, please. All right, so back to cross-compiling. This is non-trivial on machines that require it. For example, Mira, which Benson had an allocation on. I know they got the kitware team on there, so David DeMarley was on there for a long time, I believe, trying to get that to work. It was very, and also at the time, Paraview was putting in their super build system, and so there were a lot of things going on with that. It was a really involved process, so we had a lot of people from kitware that were pretty much donating their time because they were interested in getting this to work at Mira, on Mira as well, for Benson's team. Since then, they've also released a new version called Catalyst. So Catalyst is a way of compiling the libraries for the coprocessor so that you just get the filters that you need in your pipeline. So if you're only using isosurface or you're only using color maps, it will just compile that. It won't compile all of the other stuff in there. So then this, when you're doing static linking, it keeps your SOs very small. And there's also been a few slight API changes, but nothing drastic for that. And I have a link here that you can check out later for Michael Quell. This is another colleague of Benson that's really run with this and been doing some really cool videos on YouTube, and he's got a whole channel devoted to some of the things they're doing with it. Next slide, please. So we've got a couple papers in preparation. One is on scaling with the coprocessing, and then one is more on general scaling, still with the coprocessing versus other things, but it's a broader view of what they're doing. Michael is actually presenting a poster this week on what he's been doing with this. I have some more links to some interesting things people might find interesting. When Benson was at KAUST, they did some promotional videos on the science they're doing, and they were using coprocessing as an integral part of that. Again, this is the wiki book. I contributed the visualization chapter for that and another link to the repo where you can see all the code used in that course. Next slide, please. And then some general links for documentation if you're interested in looking at this for Paraview and visit for that.
So my name is Nick Neitzer. I'm with the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center. And I'd like to talk today, let me just close my door, it's noisy in the hall, sorry. Okay, so I'd like to talk today about the Data XSL. And the Data XSL is a DIBS project. So DIBS is the NSF Data Infrastructure Building Blocks program. The Data XSL sets out to really integrate data analytics with novel storage. So this is a talk on behalf of the team here at PSC. It's myself, Michael Levine, who will actually be back in the room with me in a minute, Ralph Roskis, and J. Ray Scott. Next slide, please, Sergio. As I said, the Data XSL is a DIBS project, and it's really a pilot. It's an accelerated pilot to explore the space of hardware and software architectures that will be really useful for new communities, especially to develop data analytic applications and workflows. It builds on a number of PSC technologies. One of those is the Data Supercell, which I think most people on this call know about. And it brings in two analytical engines. It folds in Blacklight, the large shared memory machine that I think everyone at XSEED knows by now. Sherlock, which people may not be familiar with, I gave an ECSS Symposium on it sometime within the last year. Sherlock is a unique system for doing graph analytics. I'll talk more about that in a few slides. Recently, to the Data XSL project, we also added the ability to couple cutting-edge database technologies with applications. And that's when we found that all of these new applications really need. In some cases, it's to manage their own data. In other cases, it's to manage their workflows. And then we have a set of pilot applications that we're using to motivate the Data XSL and its requirements, but then also to test and demonstrate what it can do. Slide 3, please. Since the Data XSL is a DIBS project, its real objectives are to deploy a set of building blocks, both hardware and software, for enabling data-intensive science. A few examples that we expect to come out of it, and this list will grow over time. It's a 4-year project. We're a few months in. First of all is /2. It's a federated file system developed here at PSC that I'll talk about in a minute. But we're deploying that now to user sites to provide very easy to use, efficient, flexible data management and data transfer. We also expect a variety of software building blocks. One set of those will provide the tight coupling between analytical resources and the novel storage that we're deploying. That's a new way of working. It gets around the old issue with when people wrote very large data to an archive and then regretted they can never get the data back. And actually being able to do these things iteratively in workflows, collaboratively over long periods of time is potentially a new way of doing science. We'll also have software building blocks to really allow distributed workflows between the Data XSL and campuses and national instruments. We have all of those represented among the pilot applications, and we see that as being a very large community requirement. In the last example here, like I said, this is just a list of examples that will grow over time, is other building blocks to enable people to couple various relational and NoSQL database technologies to their applications and their workflows. And we have some examples of that coming up. Slide 4, please, Sergio. A view of the high-level architecture of Data XSL. This really cartoon view is extremely high level. Is that the sort of gold box at the top is the Data XSL. What we have in the middle is a representation of just a large amount of tightly coupled storage. We have a fair amount online now, and more is coming in. Like I said, this is based on the Data Supercell, which has been in production here at PSC for 3 years. It's currently configured as 4 petabytes. So that's been running well. The Data XSL will extend that in a number of ways. That then is tightly coupled to both Sherlock and Blacklight, the analytical engines. And then as a whole, that connects to other national resources. Connects to campuses, the Exceed network, and then to various instruments. And so the instrument I have shown there is just the NRAO Green Bank Telescope, which is one of our pilot projects. Slide 5, please. The real point of Data XSL is to enable and accelerate data analytic applications. And so we're trying to go here beyond what we did in traditional HPC, which of course we have been doing at PSC for a long time. And what we know is that data analytics imposes constraints on the architecture that are actually very different from traditional HPC. Obviously, there are different I/O demands. There's much different system balance, much lower emphasis on flops, and much higher emphasis on flexibility, versatility, being able to move data efficiently, and different types of nodes. So when we were starting this project, we selected a group of pilot applications, and these are from very different communities, selected because they all have very high data needs, and they also have very different sorts of needs. So they're designed to probe different parts of the space of what people need in data analytics. We will add more as the Data XSL project goes on. These are being gated in pursuant to the human resources we have to deal with them. We're making good progress on a number and actually have almost all of them fully engaged now. And we're considering others to be added to this list over the coming months. So the 5 projects we're looking at initially are here on slide 5. The first is looking at gene pathways that cause tumors. This is looking deep into a data set known as the Cancer Genome Atlas that encapsulates information about a few tens of kinds of different tumors with a few hundreds of samples on each. This work is being done with Mike Bisich, Rebecca Crowley, and a host of others over at the University of Pittsburgh Department of Biomedical Informatics. And it really typifies what we're seeing in terms of research that comes from next-generation sequencing and very large genomics. There are aspects of this that are very database-intensive, graph-intensive, and obviously just I/O-intensive. The second project is titled here, Semantic Understanding of Large Multimedia Data Sets. And what that really means is being able to get at, in their current project, being able to identify feature sets of interest among large collections of video. And so this is a project that merges computer vision, machine learning, computer speech processing, optical character recognition, now semantic indexing, and all these other things to be able to query large video data sets in a very time-efficient manner. This is an IARPA-sponsored project, the goal of which is ultimately to be able to look at surveillance video and security video in time frames that let people spot where things are happening of interest before it's too late. Obviously, that can have a lot of applications in other forms of science as well, ecology, environmental science, you name it. The third project is with David Halstead and others at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, and they are looking at all sorts of radio and other astronomy, in particular merging different wavelengths from infrared up through X-ray to look at things like astrochemistry and other issues that go beyond the single modalities that people have been looking at so far. The fourth project here, Enabling Bioinformatic Workflows, is with Antron Nekrytenko at Penn State, and this is really leveraging the Galaxy framework for bioinformatics, but Galaxy is also much more general than that. In our case, for bioinformatics, and bringing in Blacklight as a computational engine, using Blacklight to using /2 to span Penn State and PSC, to move data, and to stage appropriate calculations to the analytical resources here. And the final project in this list is Data Integration and Fusion for World History. And this was with Vladimir Zadorozhny and Patrick Manning at the University of Pittsburgh, Information Science World History Data Center. And the project here is mainly with Vladimir. And here we are looking at crowdsourcing data integration and data fusion so that as people provide data to this repository, the World History Data Center, they have the tools and methods and software to let them annotate and do the data fusion such that different data sets can then be used for analysis in a meaningful way. Slide 6, please. What ties the data XSL together is the /2 distributed file system. Now, this is something that's been a project at PSC for actually quite a long time now. It was initially funded by the National Archives, and is now being funded through the Data XSL by the National Science Foundation. /2 is an open source, wide area network friendly distributed file system that really federates different underlying file systems. And so its real strength is you combine together resources at PSC, like the Data XSL, with other resources at other sites. In the case of NRAO, the Radio Astronomy Observatory, they have a large Lustre file system where they stage daily data. And we anticipate bringing that together with PSC system through /2 both sites. We already have /2 running on systems at both the Department of Biomedical Informatics at Pitt and the School of Information Sciences at Pitt for 2 of the projects we discussed in the last slide. And the advantages are actually manifold. It lets people stage data in very transparent, automatic ways. It lets us do replication and backups in sensible ways. To some extent, I think of it as edge caching. So what it lets us do is keep a copy of the data near where we're computing against it. So it has real value for research collaboration and for doing these sorts of wide area network activities where we have inherently distributed data between research projects and analysis that's going on at PSC. There's a URL at the end of the slide where you can learn more about it and download the software if you're interested. Slide 7, please. The data XSL extends /2 in a number of ways. Now, the first is really to do collaborative data analytics across researchers' sites and data sets. So we're really looking at cross-domain analytics here, bringing together different data sets from different types of research and looking at them at the same time. And that's one of the main advantages, I think, of the way the world is now looking at data-intensive computational science. The other thing is distributed web-based workflows. So we'll get back to this later, but in the context briefly of the history project, the School of Information Sciences already has web servers and databases and other resources at Pitt. And we're federating into data XSL such that data will be automatically replicated here, and they can then execute large graph-based queries on both Blacklight and eventually Sherlock to complement what they could do on normal commodity servers in their own research facility. The other way we're extending it is to really bring in computational resources for data analytics. The data supercell was purely a storage resource. So what we're bringing in now is uniquely large shared memory with Blacklight, the graph analytical capabilities of Sherlock, and obviously other things can be folded in as well. Recently we're bringing in database capabilities with database-specific nodes, and then improving performance, enhancing ease of use, and just other feature expansion and hardening. Slide 8, please. Internally /2, I want to go quickly over these because they're a bit beyond what we have time for in this talk. But /2 itself has an internal distributed architecture with a number of different types of servers to do everything from metadata, including ways of distributing that for resilience or performance, gateway nodes to provide user access, the IO nodes themselves that encapsulate other POSIX-compliant file systems as backing stores. We configure those as what we call storage building blocks. That lets us scale this out very easily. It lets us add capacities we need, and it lets us also integrate in offerings from different vendors. And then there are administrative servers for system administration and monitoring, and those have a number of features for logging and performance analysis, so we can tune and optimize the data XSL as it goes. Slide 9, please. The IO service nodes, this is a bit drilling down a bit deeper into what we had on the previous slide. And I want to skip most of these because they're beyond what we're talking about here. But the one I want to mention is at the very bottom, and that's that we do have interfaces built into cloud storage. So J. Ray Scott and his team have built in interfaces to things like Amazon EC2 and Google's cloud when we want to federate across to other things that users are using. Slide 10, please. I want to say a few words about the data supercell because this is really the roots of the data XSL. The data supercell came about when we essentially staged out tape at PSC. We realized that users can no longer effectively use tape for the size data sets that they wanted to work with and the time scales and the collaborative analytics they wanted to do. Users were wanting to work with very large data sets, tens to hundreds of terabytes, over periods of 3 to 6 months. And for that, the latencies of reading in tape just wasn't cost effective. At the same price point as tape, the data supercell was able to afford 24 times the bandwidth and about 10,000 times better latency. So looking at 15 millisecond seeks rather than 150 second seeks on tape. And so for bringing in very large data sets to do interactive analyses and ask what-if type questions when the idea comes, that was invaluable. Of course, it's highly secure, and it has features for very high reliability, going beyond standard RAID, geographical redundancy, and to optimize data replication, data movement. All those carry through to the data XSL and are being extended. Slide 11, please. The two analytical resources in the data XSL are Blacklight and Sherlock. Blacklight is the system most of you know. It is really arguably still the world's largest shared memory machine because it's 2 times 16 terabytes of shared memory. There are other single systems, there are 20, but at 2 times 16, this really gives us a lot of capacity. And what we're seeing is that for new communities, blacklight continues to be in extremely high demand. That takes several forms. One is for things like genome sequence assembly. These are applications that are written assuming very large shared memory. For large plant genomes and metagenomics, they can take multiple terabytes of shared memory, and so it's invaluable for that. There's really no other system that can give that sort of performance for those codes. There's work in the field on reducing memory requirement of some of those codes, but because there's so many that are optimal for different sorts of genomes, whether it's DNA versus RNA and other things, it's very much an art, and I see it being quite a few years before all of them are replaced by data renormalization or other techniques to reduce the memory requirements. It's also very heavily in demand by the machine learning community. And the reason for that is they have very extensive code bases built in Java, and so one really needs a system that can let them scale their programs from workstations up to very large memory using anywhere from one thread to hundreds or more threads. And so blacklight lets them do that. And we also have some users for high productivity. They're using MATLAB on blacklight or Python, or they are using OpenMP to express algorithms very efficiently. Slide 12, please. A quick example of architecture, this actually comes from J. Ray Scott, is look at /2 to afford replication between blacklight, which is the photo in the lower right, and then to allow data exchange between an analytics cluster, which can be at the user's site or at PSC, the gateway service nodes within our own system. Those are, the access to those is correlated through a user ID mapping that lets us know which user is which between them. And then that is all linked to some data source over a high-speed network. And that leverages projects at PSC in software-defined networking. We have a project called DANSAS that focuses on SDN. And so the idea here is really bring together these different resources. There could be large remote storage that may be coming from a large instrument like LSST or the Green Bank Telescope or Genome Sequencing Center, and then to bring that together through other clusters and through analytics resources at PSC, using all of these different building blocks that the ECSS is developing and testing. Slide 13, please. The other analytic resource is Sherlock. And Sherlock, as I said, there is an ECSS Symposium on recordings out there somewhere for those who are interested with a lot more detail. But the essential features are that Sherlock provides a unique resource for doing very large-scale graph analytics. This is a system developed by Yark Data, which is a subsidiary of Cray, and it couples Cray ThreadStorm processors, each of which has 128 hardware threads to tolerate latency, with the C-Star network. Together, those provide a very large hardware-supported cache-coherent shared memory space. In our cases, it's 1 terabyte, which, using the software layers in Sherlock, can represent about 10 billion edges peak, or probably 5 billion edges with doing fairly complicated queries. There are hardware accelerators in there for doing remote memory access, for preventing hotspots on certain memory locations. And we have extended this architecture with a set of 4 Opteron blades, 32 processors, to enable heterogeneous applications, incremental porting, and to serve graphical user interfaces and other interactive features. Slide 14, please. Where the Yark Data platform is called Eureka for being essentially an RDF knowledge appliance. RDF is the Resource Description Framework, which is a World Wide Web Consortium recommendation for encoding triples. Very Now, it's a moderately general way of encoding graphical data. On top of that is Sparkle. Sparkle is essentially SQL for graphs. And then there are other parts of the Apache software stack, like Jenna, Fuseki, and others, that York Data has taken and optimized for the Cray hardware that underlies Eureka. There are also web-based facilities for user interaction. Next slide, please. Okay, before I go on, I just want to make one more plug for Sherlock. We are doing a big data workshop on September 2nd. It's being run by John Urbanek here, PSC. The big data workshop is covering Hadoop, Spark, and Sherlock, or Eureka, and dealing with processing large graphs in RDF and Sparkle. There will be hands-on on Eureka in that workshop. I know the institution list is full. I don't know the participant list is sold out yet. But it's certainly an opportunity for people to gain additional experience with this architecture, especially in a hands-on sense. So back to slide 15, please. So I want to wrap up with a summary of the early status of data XSL. The early hardware, or the initial hardware, is deployed and configured. We have additional pieces on order, and those are being configured over the next month or so. We have developed a set of performance test tools and procedures, and those are being used to tune and improve the data XSL. We're working on extending and expanding /2. We have a set of action items there on which we're making steady progress. And the research groups I described earlier are engaged and are actively developing pilot applications. It's worth noting that one thing we do find there is that they've done things the way they've done them because that's largely where their comfort zone is. So when we talk about bringing in real database technologies, that often means engaging with them in a very human-intensive way, because dealing with a group that does, say, genomics or computer vision, they don't necessarily have people in the groups that are facile with data modeling, data management, and provenance. So we can help them a lot to just get these pieces in place, and then that gives them tools that they can then run with, and that we can repurpose for other communities also. Slide 16, please. A very quick overview of where each of these projects stands. The data integration and fusion for world history has been doing very well. They have a remote /2 instance in the School of Information Science that they've been running. They are running their crowdsourcing service in a distributed sense. We have a dedicated blade of Blacklight under the Data XSL project running Neo4j. It's a graph database 24/7 to serve various of their queries. We may move some of that functionality to Sherlock eventually, and off to other nodes too. Obviously, different node types are optimal for different types of databases and different queries. And the whole point is to run things on the systems where they're the most effective. We're also doing background processing for similarity scores on Blacklight, and that can be solved almost as a web crawl. These are things that can run in the background as time permits, and what they do is greatly accelerate query response when someone later comes along and wants to figure out what column types they can do a join against as they integrate new data into the history database. The other project is semantic understanding of large multimedia data sets. These folks have just completed a very large run where they have observed extremely good performance using Blacklight for analytics and the data XSL for storage. And we'll be talking more about that over time. They're working on wrapping up this round of their competition. Slide 17, please. The group at Pitt DBMI, who is looking at gene pathways underlying tumors, also has /2 running. They are using that to stage data actually from San Diego to Pitt And from Pitt, then they're doing things on both Sherlock, where they have an RDF representation of the Cancer Genome Atlas, and also doing other analyses on blacklight. The NRAO project for radio astronomy, we're just starting to spin up. We're planning a /2 instance at NRAO, where they would, on probably a daily basis, deliver the previous day's observations to PSC. Analytics to be run on blacklight or other engines. What they call workflow flags would then be placed back into the file system in /2 for migration back to NRAO, and those are the way they currently use to manage our workflow, to see where things stand, and to see what analysis products are available for subsequent science. Slide 18, please. And the last one is Galaxy, enabling bioinformatic workflows with Anton at Penn State. And for that, we are working on this distributed Galaxy instance where large memory runs like de novo genome sequence assembly would be staged to blacklight at PSC using data that is in /2, and smaller sequence alignment runs would be run on local facilities at Penn State. Slide 19, please. So in summary, Data XSL is really looking to couple analytic engines and also now database technologies to accelerate data analytics. Now we have a bunch of pilot applications that we've used to motivate and drive the Data XSL. They're now making good progress, and we're looking forward to others. As we do find new communities, one thing we do find is that their requirements are actually quite a bit different. We are certainly developing these building blocks to identify commonality between them, but it will take some time before we feel we have covered the whole space.